Greetings, everyone. The Crimean Peninsula, once proudly declared by the Kremlin as a super aircraft carrier that would never sink. The symbol of inviolable power of President Vladimir Putin now stands at the most dramatic and darkest geopolitical turning point in history. A massive panicked exodus has started as crowds flock to Russia, desperately seeking escape to the mainland. What really happened that caused one of the most solid fortresses to be shaken to its core after just 3 nights of fire and chaos? Here are the main points in today's video. The Crimea outpost tore through the S-400 shield, and the super aircraft carrier Crimea ran out of fuel. 3 nights of devastating fires have plunged the Crimea Peninsula into a historic isolation. Is President Putin's impregnable fortress turning into a deadly trap as the reserve diesel oil has run out, forcing waves of migrants into a desperate mass exodus? The Ukrainian girl destroyed fuel infrastructure at both ends of the Kerch Bridge. Ukraine has launched a program to disrupt logistics for 60,000 Russian troops by destroying fuel infrastructure at both ends of the Kerch Bridge and blocking all key sea ferry routes with a coordinated deadly strike. With this tragic geopolitical trap sprung, Crimea could be completely lost. For the first time in the history of the war, even the most ardent pro-Kremlin voices have had to admit the grim reality that Crimea could be completely lost. Is President Putin's determination to hold on to the peninsula at all costs a strategic mistake, directly draining all resources and foreshadowing a catastrophic systemic collapse? Here is the content and detailed analysis. The Russians are fleeing, 60,000 Russian soldiers in Crimea are in panic, and Ukraine has issued the final blockade order in Crimea. Before we get into the content, I hope you can take a few seconds to like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue. Thank you very much, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, the Crimean Peninsula, which the Kremlin has regarded as an inviolable symbol of power and an unsinkable warship, is now witnessing an unprecedented large-scale exodus. The wave of Russian citizens leaving this land is no longer an isolated phenomenon, but has turned into a mass exodus filled with panic. The hectic days since mid-June have completely changed the situation, turning peaceful resort beaches into departure points for crowds of people hurriedly packing their belongings to flee from the shadow of war. At train stations everywhere, the atmosphere is thick with confusion as those who once confidently settled here now loudly question the reasons for their own presence, creating a tragic picture of the collapse of a strategic belief. This overwhelming fear stems from the vital transport link between the peninsula and the Russian mainland. The strategic bridge has been repeatedly targeted and had to be closed for hours due to precise attacks. The solid defense system protecting this landmark structure was torn apart when 4 S-400 air defense missile batteries and 2 short-range Pantsir air defense systems were completely destroyed. This devastating blow not only shook the Russian military's aerial shield, but also reduced the safe operating time to a minimum of this vital military and civilian transport route. As a direct result, an unprecedented scene of chaos unfolded at both ends of the bridge. With more than 700 vehicles lining up in seemingly endless queues, thousands of civil defense personnel were left in a situation where, despite waiting for hours, their hopes were dashed in vain. 400 anti-aircraft artillery units had to wait for more than 9 hours in vain, hoping to be allowed to move toward the Krasnodar region on the mainland. Completely. Despite waiting times at manual checkpoints being extended by more than 2 hours, the panicked crowds were still willing to stay put on the road, as long as they could escape the threatened area. The deadlock reached its peak when the waterway routes were successively cut off. All ferry services, including the main ferry Panacea, were simultaneously disabled after fierce attacks at sea. These ships played a crucial role in transporting military equipment, especially missiles and launchers for the S-300 and S-400 defense systems to the Crimean front. Now, with both sea and land routes tightened and gradually closed, the Russian people understand that their once formidable warship is suffering from serious internal leaks. No one can blame them for their fear, as the once distant threat of war has become reality. It is burning down power plants, fuel storage, and gas infrastructure, gradually isolating the Crimean Peninsula in darkness. The campaign to completely isolate the peninsula has entered a new, fierce, and irreversible chapter as the Ukrainian military launches simultaneous coordinated strikes on Crimea's vital systems. The latest wave of attacks has penetrated deep into the core energy system, destroying facilities that store natural gas located right on the Takhantot Peninsula. A key command center managed the gas network and balanced seasonal consumption across the peninsula. Its destruction crippled resource transport, pressure regulation, and seasonal balancing for the whole network. Next, 4 gas compressor stations on the peninsula were successively destroyed, causing pipeline pressure to plummet drastically and preventing gas from reaching consumers. Those 4 compressor stations across the peninsula were taken out one after another, causing pipeline pressure to drop sharply and stopping the flow of gas from reaching consumers. A series of locomotive circuits in the key area were destroyed, paralyzing the peninsula's internal railway supply line. At the same time, the coastal surveillance station Mes Japan at Kamyansky was also leveled, creating a serious defensive gap in Russia's early warning system for both sea and air routes. If the initial phase of the campaign took place in a terrifying silence, but with a covertly destructive impact on invisible energy infrastructure, then the next phase was a display of power and direct destruction. The roar of squadrons and drones tore through the battle-hardened skies, followed by helpless anti-aircraft fire crisscrossing the night sky. Immediately after, a terrifying explosion shook Simferopol when the targeted site was the Tablis-Skyer thermal power plant with a capacity of 400.70 MW. This landmark project was inaugurated by Russia to ensure complete energy independence for Crimea. Russian NACA surveillance satellites recorded large-scale thermal anomalies, along with thick columns of black smoke rising from the Shogunoka area, signaling an irreparable incident. The flames of war quickly spread throughout every corner of the peninsula, from Simferopol to the strategic naval port of Sevastopol, casting darkness and the acrid smell of smoke over the entire area. The Zulavrivka gas distribution station, which connects to the main pipeline running through Simferopol and supplies fuel to numerous nearby residential areas, was completely destroyed. Meanwhile, the fuel testing warehouse and liquefied gas storage also caught fire, burning like giant torches. In particular, the road bridge over the Henneshiz Strait, a strategic corridor connecting personnel and equipment between the Crimean Peninsula and Russian forces fighting in southern Ukraine, was completely destroyed, permanently cutting off the land supply route from the south. Entering the decisive phase, the intensity reached its peak with a lightning strike directly on the port city of Kerch, the ultimate fuel logistics center for the entire occupying force. A swarm of Ukrainian suicide drones descended like a hive of angry bees, targeting the oil terminal at Terminal 1 and storage facilities for petroleum products and liquefied gas at the port of Kerch. The fuel tanks, filled with gasoline and oil, erupted in fierce flames, creating a massive sea of fire that illuminated the entire area. The industrial area of the Kerch seaport turned into an inferno, where the positions of the 630th Railway Battalion of the 39th Railway Brigade suffered heavy losses. All components of the S-400 protective fire network and the short-range Panzer air defense system guarding the Kwan bridgehead were also crushed, officially bringing down the dramatic curtain on the campaign to isolate the Crimea fortress. The scale and strategic depth of this raid lay in its coordination, with simultaneous strikes. Fuel storage tanks containing oil erupted in flames, so at the very moment the enemy's transportation lifeline was choked, another spearhead of attack simultaneously targeted the supply port, turning the Russian mainland coast in the Krasnodar region into an inferno. This was originally a key logistics transit point through the sea route, serving as a backup lifeline whenever the bridge was disrupted. The Russian girl destroyed fuel tanks at both ends of the brutal Kerch Bridge by targeting the storage infrastructure there. By striking directly at the infrastructure, such as the fuel depots at the same time, the Ukrainian army has locked down all escape routes, executing perfect discernment. The wave of drones, fully loaded and blazing, struck the Panasia ferry, causing all waterway traffic here to come to a standstill, creating a massive sea of fire. The wave of suicide drones crashing down on the Fapodasia ship completely paralyzed all waterway trade activities here. The sea lit up, and the direction toward the Azov Sea was cut off, as at least 10 consecutive large explosions pushed the traffic artery on the bridge into a state of complete lockdown for many hours. When dawn broke and the full picture of the fiery night was revealed, the world was stunned to realize the massive scale of a military campaign marking a turning point. President Volodymyr Zelensky declared that the attacks had pierced the opponent's defenses at long range. President Volodymyr Zelensky said they breached the opponent's defense up to 300 kilometers from the front line, calling it as effective as psychological sanctions. The assessment is based on the front line. Because these are like waves of punishment, when the fiery battle dawns, the world is overwhelmed by the sheer scale, and only those who submit to the power and long-range combat capabilities of Ukraine will be the tools to restore peace. A kind of supreme power, which now every Russian soldier and civilian in this land is experiencing as a consequence of military operations. In fact, about 60,000 Russian soldiers stationed on the Crimean Peninsula are currently in a precarious situation and everyone here is directly suffering the consequences. In fact, about 60,000 Russian soldiers stationed on the Crimean Peninsula are currently in such a situation. All their livelihoods and combat capabilities depend entirely on supplies from outside. A modern picture cannot function without oil. Tanks will turn into immobile blocks of steel. Peaceful scenes will lose their vitality, and supply convoys will not be able to transport ammunition to the front lines. The tragedies don't stop there. All military bases, command centers, and early warning stations throughout Crimea maintain their operations thanks to generators powered by locally refined oil. When the panoramic displays of the ultra-modern S-400 air defense complex lose their continuous power supply, at night the sky is left vulnerable as the S-400 air defense system loses its constant electricity. The shield over the sky will immediately go blind, leading to a collapse, a chain military collapse of the information and communication network, control centers, drones, and the entire reconnaissance and intelligence system. After 3 nights of heavy bombardment, main refueling stations were cut off and reserve generator fuel was severely depleted. A rendering crisis appeared. When the system was paralyzed, the phase was directly threatened and the chain of command was disrupted. Losing 4 S-400 systems and 2 Panzer units left gaps in air defense, leaving Crimea's skies exposed. The destruction of the massive S-400 radar systems and 2 Panzer units created deadly gaps. A tragic spiral. The weaker the defense, the easier and more devastating the enemy's next attacks become. The once mighty Black Sea Fleet is now in a state of military retreat. When the resistance movement ATS was revealed, the fleet command had to hastily draw up a plan to withdraw all forces from Sevastopol to the port of Novorossiysk, deep within Russian territory. Experts believe this is the ultimate strategic move to turn Crimea into a deserted land, a deadly trap where the Russian military no longer has a foothold. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense turned this strategy into the logistics lockdown program and invested $155 million to boost strike capabilities. The military collapse quickly impacted all areas of life. Civilian life has been pushed into crisis, plunging the peninsula into a major disaster. As dawn breaks, the entire scene is overshadowed by anxiety and uncertainty, and the strategic position of Crimea could be completely lost. The energy shock is not limited to Sungrao. The direct assault of the Tabrishskaya power facility has caused the power grid in the northern Vitai areas, the central region, and the southern coastal strip to completely collapse. The city of Sevastopol had to implement rolling blackouts. The 129 MW mobile power station in Balaklava district was activated, illustrating the situation. The Zhangkoi power outage caused the pumping system to fail, severely reducing water supply to small amounts delivered every 2 hours. Darkness and hardship covered Kop, marking a critical turning point. The stifling heat reached up to 30 degrees Celsius. Despite desperate pleas from government advisors urging people to turn off all air conditioning and unnecessary electrical devices, the peninsula's transportation system was on the verge of total collapse. When the sea route was suspended, convoys of oversized trucks were forced to reroute through the land corridor via Taganrog, Mariupol, and Melitopol to enter Crimea. A supply route stretching hundreds of kilometers was completely within the range of Ukrainian drone strikes. The strategic trap was closing, and the defenders were utterly powerless to reverse the situation. Translate step by step. The trap was closing, and despite air defenses, firepower teams, and claiming to have shot down up to 239 drones, the defenders couldn't conceal battlefield losses. The Russian side's defense efforts failed, and although they acknowledged the use of drones, the losses on the battlefield could not be concealed. Russia's defensive efforts did not fail because of tactics, but the collapse was due to systemic failures. Ukraine launched a swarm tactic, sending hundreds of drones at once from different directions, causing Russian air defense systems to become overwhelmed as they had to track and engage up to 8 targets at the same time. The steel shields that shaped that fateful night left lasting scars in Crimea's sky. The defense system at Kerch had weakened to the point of helplessness, completely standing by as the strategic oil port was engulfed in a sea of fire. A geopolitical reality is being exposed as the defense system at Kerch has weakened to the point of helplessness, completely standing by as the strategic oil port was consumed in flames. The military vulnerability of the historic Kerch Bridge is becoming increasingly exposed as the defensive shield surrounding it is gradually eroded day by day. The bridge is facing an extremely severe asymmetric technological crisis as the defensive shield surrounding it is gradually eroded day by day. Moscow is facing an extremely harsh asymmetric technological crisis. Crimea was originally built on the assumption of an absolutely secure rear, but Ukraine's technological advances have shattered that illusion. Now Russia will have to choose between protecting the Kerch Bridge, the naval base, the thermal power plant, or the gas infrastructure. They can't protect everything at once while the opponent attacks multiple targets simultaneously. These are calculated strikes, not random shots. That is the battlefield of a strategy of isolation.
Đang đồng loạt khai hỏa vào mọi mục tiêu.
A systematic approach, carefully developed over years since the major counteroffensive. History's wheel has turned backward. The strategy of systematically isolating Crimea, calculated and built up over many years, originated from the major counteroffensive. The wheel of history has turned backward. As the situation clarifies, observers see this strategy using long-range firepower to make the route unusable. General Banievsky, former U.S. military commander in Europe, described this siege strategy in a chilling three-step roadmap.
Tại châu Âu đã đúc kết chiến lược vây hãm này bằng một bước đầy lạnh lùng. Đầu tiên là
Sweet.
phải đến sang coi và hủy diệt cộng.
Looking at the whole peninsula, I broke the supply line to Sankoy and destroyed the Kerch Bridge. Next, I turned this place into a living hell, making it impossible for Russian forces to garrison. And finally, I pushed the isolation effort forward, simultaneously on all three fronts. The scene of the night fire, with Ukraine's massive sea drones dominating the waters around the peninsula, sinking or damaging Black Sea Fleet ships, forcing the remaining warships to retreat and seek shelter in Novorossiysk. When the waterway lifeline through the Kerch Strait was constantly threatened and the Panasia ferry was sunk, the last supply route was officially closed. On the ground, forces from the Azov Battalion claimed to have used drone squadrons to control the highway at night in the south. The massive Azov force announced they used drone squadrons to control strategic routes, turning supply tanker trucks into a fiery road of wreckage. In the skies, systematic attrition strikes targeted the air defense network, gradually wearing down Crimea's protective shield, turning every exposed gap into an invitation for the next devastating blow. If Russia loses control of Crimea, this will be one of the biggest military campaign failures of the 21st century for Russia. So, in your opinion, will Putin allow the loss of control over the Crimean Peninsula?
Đối với Nga,
So, in your opinion, will Putin allow the loss of control over the Crimean Peninsula?